Thank you for coming and for coming to listen to my story. It's really a wonderful privilege to be able to share a bit about my own history. It's very rare that I have an opportunity to do that, so I very much appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to share my life really in three sections. A bit of my early life, which really was very significant in shaping my decision to move into theology as a vocation. And then a bit of my experience in Seattle, Washington, which was also very important in my own formation. And then finally my time and experience here in Boston. I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and grew up in El Paso, Texas. And spent really my early life along the U.S.-Mexican border. And that experience and those years, more than any other, have really shaped me and shaped my imagination. I'm Mexican-American, and my family came to this country because of the Mexican Revolution. All four of my grandparents were born in Mexico, and then as a result of the revolution in the early 1900s, they all came into the southwestern part of the United States. There was a great deal of poverty in my grandparents. They experienced a great deal of poverty. I had one grandfather who was a sharecropper and another who worked to lay railroad ties for Southern Pacific throughout southern New Mexico. So I come from really very humble roots. But my family was very much committed to the Catholic Church. And so I grew up in a home that had all kinds of images of like Our Lady of Guadalupe on the walls and San Martín Caballero, which is a saint that is a saint who gives his cloak to a person who is poor and suffering. So my home and my early experience was suffused with all these images. And they really helped me to develop a sense of Catholicism that was very sacramental and intimate, a sense of the sacred as being really part of everyday life, and that was really quite important in my early years. My mother organized the posadas in our neighborhood every year, so we celebrated that in our home. When the posadas is the reenactment of the story of Mary and Joseph going from door to door looking for lodging before the birth of Jesus, and so we would do that, going knocking on the doors of our neighbors in the neighborhood. And then we'd have a big party in our home and have tamales and hot chocolate, and it was great fun. So I grew up with a sense of Jesus and God and Guadalupe as being very intimate and close, and part of just my whole world. The El Paso border area was really important as well because in my early years I saw a lot of poverty. Especially El Paso and Juarez share a border, and at night you can't see the distinction between the two cities because it's basically one in the Rio Grande, which is, the Great River is probably about 3 or 4 feet wide through much of the area that it goes through, where it crosses between El Paso and Juarez. So so there is a great deal of intimacy between the two cities. And I grew up seeing a lot of Border Patrol vans up and down the freeway, picking up people who were undocumented, taking them back. And it was like this great cat and mouse game that was constantly played out along the border. And there's a freeway that runs right parallel to the border, I-10, and you can look across and see Juarez right there. And so I grew up seeing all these casas de cartón dotting the Juarez skyline and all the adobe houses, and every winter you would hear stories at this time of year of people who would freeze to death because they didn't have enough heating in their homes. So the reality of poverty was very significant in my early life, and I remember wondering why, and wondering why God allowed this to happen, that certain people would grow up and have a certain level of stability like I had in my family, and yet there were a number of people who were very poor and were struggling just to find food to eat and a place to live. And I remember realizing early on that poverty, that the poor and people who were very vulnerable had a privileged place. And I came to realize that, I think, largely initially through examples of other people, like Mother Teresa. When I was about 16 years old, she came to El Paso, Texas. She was very interested in the experience of people who were poor and suffering with AIDS at that time in El Paso, and was wanting to go. She wanted to go to Juarez to see the jail in Juarez, and I was always struck, like, why would you come here to El Paso, Texas, and ask to see the jail in Juarez? And so that stayed with me and was very striking to me. Shortly after I graduated from college, I went to college at Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles. I decided to spend a year, like a JVC year, in Palomas, Chihuahua, which is a small border town just south of the U.S.-Mexican border, but south of the state of New Mexico. And Palomas has the great claim to fame that, at least prior to 9/11, it was the last port of entry where there was a military aggression on U.S. soil, which is probably a little-known fact. But Pancho Villa came across the border at Palomas, and he burned down Camp Furlong, which was a military encampment in Columbus, New Mexico, and ran back across the border. And there were all of these U.S. military that went out chasing Pancho Villa, and they never found him. And so General Patton, I believe, was out chasing Pancho Villa in the deserts of Chihuahua and never was able to catch up with him. So anyway, so I spent a year in Palomas, and really that was a life-changing year. Very much like, it was not through the JVCs, but it's very much like a JVC year. It really was quite significant in terms of a number of things. I certainly wanted to serve, but I think probably even more than that, to be brutally honest. I really was a journey of self-discovery and adventure. I was 22 and was addicted to adventure, and I thought, well, this would be a great kind of an experience to go and live in a real small rural community, and to learn Spanish. And so growing up in El Paso, I didn't really learn to speak Spanish. My parents, like many in the Southwest, knew a lot of oppression from speaking Spanish themselves as children. They didn't know English when they were early on in their lives. They didn't speak English. And as a result of that, they purposely didn't teach myself and my brothers and sister how to speak Spanish. So going to Palomas was a journey of discovery. And one of the stories that I want to share about my time there has to do with the celebration of Our Lady of Guadalupe. On the 11th of December, we were gathered in the church to celebrate. We were going to have a midnight mass, and about an hour before that midnight mass, there was a procession of people coming into the church sharing either poetry or music, a variety of things in honor of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And Palomas is a really small town. There's only 5,000 people there. So about midnight, there's a group of women that come into the church, and they're women, and they're carrying these just massive volumes of red roses that were very fragrant and beautiful. And I was really struck, like, where do you get red roses like this in the deserts in Chihuahua, out in the middle of, basically, I mean, it's just very stark and dry. And then who are these women? And the crowd separated in the church, and these women processed in, and they offered their roses to Guadalupe, and the mariachi sang. And I kept wondering, because I knew, like virtually most people in this little town, and we all knew one another. And one of the young women I was with leaned over and she said, "These are the cantineras." And I said, "Oh, okay." So the cantineras, the women who lived in the cantinas, in the brothels, so they were prostitutes who were from a lot of the poor communities surrounding Palomas, whose families were so poor that the only thing that they were able to do to make money, these women, was to work as prostitutes in the cantinas. And that really struck me because I remember just thinking, and still to this day, I was struck by the fact that, wow, this would never happen in the United States. You wouldn't see women prostitutes coming into a Catholic church and offering some kind of a devotion. And to realize, well, there's a sensibility here, a Catholic sensibility of understanding the sacred that really permeates the whole of life. And that's what these women really helped me to understand and to appreciate the importance of an affirmation of human dignity, and that how important that is, and how they felt their own dignity affirmed in Guadalupe and offering roses to Guadalupe. So that really stayed with me, and that year I also had an opportunity to meet Gustavo Gutierrez, and I at the time was, as I said, 22 years old, and in the summer I met him at the Mexican American Cultural Center in San Antonio, Texas. I spent a few weeks there. And he and I remember being really, I had just read, a theology of liberation, and I was very excited about it. And I told him, well, I'm giving this year of service, and isn't this wonderful, and blah blah blah. And I was very bubbly and really excited about all this. And then he just looked at me and he said, well, now is this a commitment just for a year, or is this for a lifetime? And I was just like, oh my God. I mean, I was 22, it's like, wait a second. And I remember just being speechless, and just even recalling it today, not knowing how do I begin to respond to this. And I wasn't thinking beyond, this is just a year, and then as it turned out, I'll go work in an insurance agency. But that question has haunted me all my life. And what I came to realize in the year that I spent in Palomas is I realized that I really was a very wealthy woman, and I would have never identified myself as a wealthy woman prior to that year. My family is pretty modest and in terms of our income. But by virtue of having a bachelor's degree and by virtue of the opportunities that were in front of me, I realized in relationship to a lot of the people in Palomas that, in fact, yes, I am. I'm a very wealthy person. And I realized, too, that it wasn't because of any of merit on my part. I mean, it isn't that I somehow worked harder than the people in Palomas and so, therefore, deserved this. They worked every bit as hard as I, and many of them were certainly much brighter than I am. And I knew that from getting to know them personally. So coming up against that reality and asking, why God, why are there people who have to struggle and suffer so hard, and really they don't have many choices in the future of their lives. So that year was very, very much life-changing. I left Palomas and went to live in El Paso, Texas afterwards, and became very bored with working in insurance after a few years, thinking, well, there was something very life-giving and quite engaging and interesting about Palomas. I think I'll work in pastoral ministry. But I had no background in theology or ministry at the time, so I decided I need to go pursue a master's degree. And I went and moved to Seattle, Washington, and began a Master's of Divinity there, and eventually stayed on and worked in the Archdiocese of Seattle. And while there, I mean, that was also very life-changing, because I worked with Archbishop Hunhausen, who at the time was being investigated. And he was such a witness to me. He at the time would spend his Good Fridays, and it's interesting to think about this as we begin Lent, he would spend Good Fridays at the submarine base in Bangor, Washington, the nuclear submarine base, protesting. And so we'd do a vigil at the tracks. And I thought, wow, this is something for the Archbishop to spend Good Friday at the tracks of the nuclear submarine base. And then he made it public that he wasn't going to pay his personal taxes, as a way to protest the U.S. buildup of nuclear armaments. And so that got published all over the Seattle Times, and he called Bangor the Auschwitz of Puget Sound, and that became the headlines of the Seattle Times. And I just thought, wow, what a courageous man. he was a very, very humble man to meet him too. I mean, he was not. He just was extremely humble. I remember once driving out of the parking lot of the Chancery, and a homeless man coming up to him and asking him for some money. And this homeless man had no idea who he was approaching, you know. And Hunhausen, you know, gave him some money and suggested where he might go for further help. But he was just very, very low-key and very humble. But he taught me that it was really important to love the local church. And I have been forever grateful to him for that, because he used to make it a point to be a presence throughout the Archdiocese of Seattle, and was really committed to that. And that time, during that time as well, he was very committed to the diversity of the Catholic Church. So there was a lot of work done in terms of Native American communities, and I did a lot of work on the among various Salish communities, Native American communities, at the Lummi Reservation and different reservations that had a Catholic presence. And so that really taught me much more the importance of the Catholicity and the vision and the gift of the Catholicity of the Church, and how important it is to keep that. I also served at one point on a committee of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops for the Campaign for Human Development. That was through my work in the Archdiocese. And in that time I learned that there weren't very many resources across the whole country in terms of Latinos and the coming Latino church in the United States. And I would frequently attend Mass in Spanish, and virtually everybody in the Mass, at the Masses I would attend, was younger than I, and I'd go to Mass in English, and most everybody was older than I. And so it was like, wow, you know, here is the wave of the future, and where are we going with this as a church? And I always have been committed to spiritual direction, and I was in spiritual direction during this time of my life, and I was very started to reflect on my own legacy, and was very happy working in the Archdiocese there, but began to think, you know, what I would really like to be able to say at the end of my life is that I made a contribution to the Catholic Church in terms of Latinos and interpreting the Latino faith experience. And so it was out of really my experience in spiritual direction that I made a decision to resign and move away from direct pastoral ministry and move into academia. So the direction, the spiritual direction, was very, very significant for me. And I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area and began a PhD in systematic theology there, and worked there for many years. And in the process of finishing up my dissertation, which I wrote a dissertation on Our Lady of Guadalupe, Tom Groom called me up, and I had never met Tom Groom before and didn't know really a whole lot about Tom Groom, to be honest. And he said, well, maybe we could meet each other at a CTSA meeting and have a conversation. He says, you know, Boston College has a position open, and were you planning to apply? And I said, I didn't even have any idea that there was a position. I wasn't really I had a job. I wasn't on the market for a position. So no, I mean, I wasn't looking for jobs at the time. And I said, well, I'm really in the middle of writing my dissertation right now. And so, you know, so that's really where my energies are focused, and I'm not really looking at applying for positions at the moment. And so I had a job at St. Mary's College of Moraga in a tenure track position there. So I basically had the future at that point for me mapped out. And so then about 3 or 4 months later, he says, well, he calls me up again. He says, well, we haven't received your application yet, and we're going to go through all the applications we have here in about 3 days. And so, you know, so maybe you'd like to submit an app. So I thought, okay. So I stopped my work on the dissertation, and I quickly pulled together an application and submitted it. And I thought, well, this is, this is really nice for him to do this, and I feel very flattered, but nothing will probably come of it. I mean, I didn't really think that, because I felt like, well, Boston College is a place you go when you've been 5 or 6 years somewhere else, and you've established a reputation, and I don't even have a dissertation finished yet. So it was sort of beyond my vision at that point in my life. And one thing led to another, and I was offered the position, which really surprised me at the time, and I was very grateful. But I was very excited about coming here, because part of what I feel my own vocation is to, as I said, make a contribution to the Latino church in the United States into the future. And I really wanted to interpret that experience, and wanted to, when I started my doctoral work, there was only one institution in the country where you could pursue a PhD in systematic theology and study with a Latino theologian, and that was at the GTU in Berkeley. And that was the reason I went to the GTU. It was because I could study with, at that time, Alejandro Garcia Rivera. And Roberto Goizueta wasn't here. I met with him in Chicago and was interested in working with him in Chicago. Chicago did not offer a PhD in systematics at that point in history. And so the opportunity to come to Boston College was really an opportunity to make my dream come alive in terms of the institution making a commitment to the future of the Latino church in the United States. And so I'm just very, very excited and delighted to be here. And I'm working right now on a book entitled Suffering Community and the Possibility of Salvation. And it's a book that has to do with the women in Juarez who are experiencing right now feminicide. And I think the experience of evil is an experience of feminicide, meaning that women, young, poor women, and girls are being murdered between the ages of about 15 and 25. So, and it's been going on since 1993. It's really, in part, the result of NAFTA. The passage of NAFTA is very significant in the onset of this feminicide. And I think that it begs all kinds of questions about evil and how we face evil and deal with the question of a release from evil. So that really is what I'm focused on, and it's obviously coming as well out of my experience of being born in, well, not born, but raised certainly in El Paso, and much of my family still lives in the El Paso area, so I'm back there fairly often to visit family. So I'll stop there. I don't even know how long I've been talking, but